Montana Territory, 1879. The wind cut sharp across the flats near Gallatin Valley as Marabeth Ellery held both of her children close and watched the wagon disappear down the trail, taking with it everything she had left of safety, what little there was. Her brother-in-law had not even looked back. Not even when Elric cried out for him. Not even when little Elsie, barely 3, clutched her rag doll tighter and whispered, "Mama, why is Uncle Owen leaving?" Marabeth's hands trembled as she tucked a blanket tighter around their shoulders. "Because we are not his to carry," she said, though her voice caught in her throat. The man had taken her in after her husband died last winter. But come spring, when food was short and mouths were many, he made it plain twins were too much. She was too much, a burden. So now, with nothing but a satchel of dry cornbread, a rifle she barely knew how to use, and 2 little ones depending on her, she stood alone in the middle of nowhere. The sky above her stretched wide and empty. "Mama," Elric said, "where do we go now?" Marabeth forced a smile she did not feel. "We walk." They had not gone far when the sky darkened. The storm rolled in fast, the kind that turned dirt to syrup and wind to fists. She found a narrow cut in the land, a dry creek with enough of an overhang to shield them from the worst of it. She wrapped the children in her coat, pressed them against her, and sang low to keep her own fear from crawling too close. That was how he found them. The next morning, with mist still clinging to the grass, a horse's hooves crunched nearby. Marabeth rose fast, rifle in shaking hands, and stood between the stranger and her children. The man pulled his horse to a stop and raised both hands. "Easy," he said. "Not here to hurt you." He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a trail-worn coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his eyes. But she could see the kindness in them. Brown, steady, not full of pity, just looking. "You lost?" he asked. "No," she said, though she clearly was. "You alone." She hesitated, then stepped aside enough to show the children behind her. His eyes softened when he saw them, especially the little girl, rubbing sleep from her eyes with the back of one hand. He dismounted slowly. "Name's Thayer Abbott. I got a place not far from here. Cabin, barn, some chickens. You all can come rest, get warm. No strings." Marabeth narrowed her eyes. "Why would you help us?" Thayer looked at the twins again. "Because someone should have. That should not have been enough. But it was." They rode double on his horse, the children in front, Marabeth behind Thayer, her hands gripping the saddle horn. Not him. She did not trust him. Not yet. But the warmth of his back and the steady clop of the horse's hooves were better than the cold. His place was small but clean. A one-room cabin with a stone hearth, a cot, and a bunk. Chickens scratched behind a crooked fence. A dog barked once, then wagged its tail. Thayer built a fire, handed her a dry blanket, and let Elric feed the chickens while Elsie curled into a pile of quilts on the cot. "You can stay here," he said, offering her a tin cup of coffee. "As long as you need." "I do not have anything to pay you with," she said. He met her eyes. "I am not asking for anything." She studied him for a long moment. "You do not know me. Then maybe you should tell me your name." "Marabeth Ellery." He nodded once. "All right, Marabeth Ellery." The days passed quiet. She stayed. At first because she had no choice. Then because the children laughed more here. Elric helped Thayer split wood and learned how to mend a fence. Elsie picked flowers and followed the dog around like a shadow. And Marabeth. She started to breathe again. She watched Thayer from the porch one evening, sleeves rolled to the elbow, arms taut as he lifted hay. He had not once asked for thanks, not once treated her like a burden. "You are good with them," she said when he came inside. He shrugged. "They are good kids. They are not yours." He looked at her. "Does not mean I cannot care." She did not answer, but something in her chest shifted. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, she sat at the hearth while Thayer whittled a block of wood into something that looked like a horse. He glanced at her. "You ever think of what comes next?" "All the time. I mean for you. Not just surviving. Living." She looked at her hands. "I used to. Before." He set the carving down. "You could still have that. A life. Something steady." She raised her eyes. "With who?" "The world tossed me aside. Thayer." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Not everyone." There was something in his voice, gentle but certain. She felt it settle into her bones. But she was not ready. Not yet. Still, when he reached across and took her hand, she did not pull away. The next morning, she woke to laughter. Elric was riding a carved wooden horse across the porch, and Thayer stood just inside the door with Elsie on his shoulders, both of them giggling. She watched them and felt something she had not in a long time. Hope. Hope, and the beginning of something she never thought she would get to feel again. She stepped outside, sunlight warming her shoulders, and for the first time in months, she smiled without forcing it. Thayer looked over and smiled back. And right then she knew. Maybe this was not just shelter. Maybe it was the start of a home. The first frost glazed the edges of the fence rails by early October. Marabeth rose before the sun, her hands red from the washpan and her skirts damp at the hem from the morning dew. Inside, the children still slept, curled into each other like pups in a den, their breath soft and even. She watched them a moment more, then stepped out into the pale light. Thayer was already in the barn. She could hear the scrape of a shovel and the low murmur of his voice as he spoke to the mare while cleaning her stall. He talked to his animals like they were neighbors, not livestock. That quiet kindness, how it never wavered, had started to seep into her in places she thought were sealed shut. He looked up as she stepped into the doorway. "Coffee's on the stovetop," he said, brushing hay from his sleeve. "You didn't have to come out this early." "I know," she said, brushing her palms on her apron. "But I wanted to learn the milking. If I'm going to stay, I ought to be useful." Thayer leaned his weight back against the stall door. "You've been useful every day since you walked onto this land, Marabeth. I'm not talking about sweeping and boiling beans." Neither of them smiled, but something passed between them, an understanding that did not need to be named. By mid-morning, she had milk on her boots and a sore shoulder, but the bucket was full and the children were chasing the dog across the pasture. She watched Thayer mend a bit of fencing near the creek, sleeves rolled again, but this time she didn't look away when he caught her watching. Later, while the children napped, she sat on the porch steps carding wool from an old sheep fleece he'd traded for in town. Her fingers moved slow, catching on the burrs and tangles. She'd done this before, years ago on her family's homestead in Kansas, before the fever took her mother, before her father married again, before she was sent away to live with her aunt, who had more rules than warmth. Thayer came around the side of the cabin, wiping his hands on a rag. "You know how to spin?" "I did. Once." She held up a wad of carded wool. "I'd need a spindle." "I've got one in the loft," he said. "Belonged to my mother. She used to sit out here just like that." Marabeth set the wool aside. "She pass on. Year before last. Winter took her quick." He sat on the step below her, not looking up. She liked quiet things. Chickens. Reading by lamplight. "I got that from her, I think." Marabeth twisted the wool between her fingers, not spinning, just feeling the rhythm of it. "What about your father?" "Gone long before that. He wasn't much for sticking." She didn't ask more. He didn't offer more. But when she reached for the wool again, his hand brushed hers, and neither of them moved away right away. That evening a rider came down the trail. Stranger. Dusty coat, one saddlebag, and a rifle lashed crosswise. Thayer stepped off the porch the moment he spotted him, hand resting near his holster, not threatening, just ready. The man raised a hand. "Name's Harlan Finch. I'm looking for work or word of it. They said at the general store you might need help before the snows." Thayer didn't answer straight away. He glanced back at Marabeth, who stood in the doorway, one hand resting lightly on the frame. "Got help already," Thayer said evenly. "Families come to stay." Harlan's eyes flicked toward her, then back. "Fair enough. Just asking." Thayer gave him a tin of water and sent him on his way with directions to the next ranch. Afterward, he didn't say anything as he washed up, but his jaw was tight, and he splintered kindling sharper than usual. Marabeth stood beside him at the stove that night while he dried his hands. "You didn't have to say that." "Say what?" "That we were family." He glanced at her. "Weren't lying." She didn't know what to say to that. But when she turned back to the fire, she was standing closer than before, and she didn't step away. The days shortened. The hills browned. The air tasted like wood smoke and the promise of snow. Thayer took the children to check the trap lines, teaching Elric how to walk quiet and watch the wind. Marabeth started baking, her hands remembering how to knead and shape without recipe or measure. One evening, after the children had gone to bed beneath quilts she'd finally mended, Thayer lingered by the hearth while she swept. He didn't speak at first, just watched the firelight catch the curve of her cheek and the soft turn of her mouth. "I've been thinking," he said after a long silence. Marabeth set the broom aside. "About what?" "About winter. About what comes after. About what we're building here." She didn't move. "You mean the barn?" He shook his head. "No, I mean us." She looked at him then, steady and sure. "I didn't think you'd say it first. I figured you'd earned the right to choose what happens next." Marabeth stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat of the fire between them. "I want to stay, not just for the roof or the meals. I want to build something with you, if you still want that." Thayer's voice was low. "I do." When she reached for his hand, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Outside, the wind shifted from east to north, but inside the cabin the warmth held. The first real snow came in early November, thick as sifted flour and quiet as breath. It blanketed the pasture and softened the edges of every sound. The world slowed. Even the chickens moved like they were thinking twice about each step. Inside the cabin, the heat held steady, and the rhythm of their days tucked into a kind of peace Marabeth had never known before. One morning, she woke to the muffled hush of snowfall and the scent of sourdough rising on the hearth. Thayer had already gone out to the barn. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside, the snow brushing against her skirts as she made her way across the yard. He was brushing the mare down, steady strokes, his breath curling in front of him. He looked up when she entered, but said nothing. She liked that about him, that silence wasn't something to be filled, only shared. She reached for the straw fork. "I can help." "I know." They worked side by side, not speaking, the sounds of the animals and the snow settling around them. Afterward, he poured oats into a tin scoop and handed it to her. "We'll need to ride into town tomorrow," he said. "There's feed waiting at the Smith place. I bartered for it last week." She nodded. "I can go with you." He hesitated. "It's a long ride. Cold." "I've ridden colder," she said. "And besides, the twins could use the day with the dog and a warm fire. I'll ask Mrs. Keller to look in on them." He gave a small nod. "All right, then." The next day they left early. The trail to town wound through timber and low hills, the trees bare and reaching. Marabeth rode astride now, not side saddle, not since the day she dropped that old way without asking permission. Thayer didn't blink at the change then, and he didn't now. He rode slightly ahead, his rifle tied across his saddle, glancing back every so often to make sure she was still close. The town had grown since she last passed through. A second mercantile, a blacksmith with a new forge, and a church steeple now stood above the rooftops. Children chased each other through icy puddles. A man in a thick coat tipped his hat to her as they passed. Thayer led her to the smith place, where a woman with wind-chapped cheeks gave them the feed sacks and a wrapped parcel of dried apples. As they tied down the load, Marabeth glanced toward the small schoolhouse at the edge of town. "They're taking in new students," Thayer said quietly, following her gaze. "I heard it from one of the ranch hands last week." She looked at him. "Elric's ready. Elsie too. We could bring them in once a week, maybe more when the snow clears." She paused. "You said we." He didn't answer right away. "I meant it." They rode back slower, the sun already low. Near the bend in the trail, her horse stumbled slightly, and Thayer reached across instinctively, his hand on her arm. She steadied the reins, then met his eyes. "You still think this is just helping out?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, I haven't thought that in some time." She didn't speak again until they reached the cabin. The windows glowed from within, and the smell of stew reached them as they dismounted. Inside, Elric ran to her, face flushed. "We made cornbread, Mama. Mrs. Keller showed us." Elsie clung to her apron, her curls tangled from play. Marabeth kissed the top of her head. "Did you behave?" "She brought us a picture book," Elric said. "Thayer, it had a train in it." Thayer crouched beside him. "You ever see a train before?" "No, but I want to." Marabeth met Thayer's eyes across the room. "Maybe someday." That night, after the children had been tucked in, she stood by the window, watching the snow fall in slow spirals under the moonlight. She heard Thayer behind her, setting down the poker by the hearth. "You ever think about a wedding?" she asked, not turning. "I have," he said. She turned then. "You'd want that?" "With me?" "I would." She walked to him, slow and sure. "Then I think we should." He reached for her hand, and she let him have it. They didn't say more. They didn't need to. Outside, the wind shifted, but inside, the future was already beginning. The wedding took place beneath a pale sky, the ground still hard with frost but the air clear, calm. There were no ribbons, no preacher's robes or printed invitations, just the land, the people who mattered, and the quiet steadiness of something long earned. Marabeth wore a wool dress the same shade as early spring sage, one she'd let down and mended herself. Thayer had brushed his coat and trimmed his beard, and his hands, though rough, shook slightly when he took hers. Mrs. Keller stood between them with a Bible in her lap and tears on her cheeks. She didn't read from it, just spoke plain words in a clear voice, the kind that didn't need to reach heaven to feel holy. Afterward, Elric handed Marabeth a bundle of dried prairie flowers tied with string. "I picked the ones that won't crumble fast," he said. "So you can keep them longer." She knelt beside him. "That's just right." Elsie had braided 2 scraps of ribbon into Thayer's shirt cuff and pressed her cheek to his side without a word. He rested his hand gently on her small back, and they stood like that a long time. They did not have a dance or a feast, just coffee by the fire that night, and the comfort of knowing no one was leaving. When the children had fallen asleep, Marabeth folded her shawl and set it on the stool, then turned toward the man who had taken them all in without asking for anything back. "I didn't think I'd feel steady again," she said. "Not in this lifetime." He crossed the room slowly. "You're not the only one." She took his hand, the one with the nicked knuckle and the calluses. "We'll keep building it. Together." Thayer nodded. Day by day, winter settled in full that week. The snow deepened, and the trees bowed beneath it. Each morning, Thayer shoveled a path to the barn while Marabeth warmed a brick to tuck into the children's bedrolls. They traded eggs for lamp oil and cut meat thin to make it last. The quiet was no longer the kind that pressed on her chest. Simply was. One afternoon, while the twins were tracing letters at the table, a knock came at the door. Thayer opened it to a man wrapped in a buffalo hide coat, his beard crusted with snow. He looked to be in his 30s, pale eyes, a scar down his left cheek. "You Abbott?" he asked. Thayer stepped out, pulling the door behind him. "Depends on who's asking. Name's Joshua Varnes. I'm looking for my niece. Her name's Ellery, Marabeth Ellery." Inside, Marabeth froze. She hadn't heard that name in over a year. She opened the door herself, coat unbuttoned, hands still dusted with flour. "I'm here." Varnes looked at her, surprise flickering just beneath his weariness. "Lord, Mary, thought you'd be dead or worse." "I nearly was," she said. "But I'm not." He looked past her into the warm cabin, at the children bent over their letters, and then back at Thayer. "You the one who kept her upright?" Thayer didn't answer. He didn't need to. Varnes shifted his weight. "I came because your father passed last spring. Left a bit of land near Osage County. Not much, but it's yours." Marabeth folded her arms. "He didn't leave me anything while he lived." "I know. I ain't saying you owe him grief. Just figured you ought to know." She nodded once. "Thank you." Varnes hesitated. "You're not coming back east, then?" Thayer's hand brushed hers. "Not for show, just grounding." "No," she said. "I'm not." Varnes tipped his hat. "Then I'll be on my way. You've got more than most, from the looks of it." After he left, she stood at the window a long moment, watching his figure fade into the trees. Thayer came to stand beside her. "You all right?" "I think so. You don't have to talk about him." "I don't want to," she said. "There's nothing there worth digging up." That night, she sat beside Thayer at the fire, her feet tucked beneath her, his arm along the back of the bench. The cabin didn't feel borrowed anymore. It was theirs in every nail and board. "You didn't ask if I wanted that land." "I didn't need to," he said. "I know you." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "It's strange, isn't it? How peace can sneak up on you." "Not strange," he murmured. "Just rare." Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the lamp burned soft, and the warmth between them needed no words. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living, together. By late February, the sun rose earlier and held longer above the mountains, casting long gold across the snow-packed yard. The hard season was softening at the edges. Ice still clung to the eaves, but the wind no longer whined so sharply through the chinks of the cabin walls. Inside, the warmth came not only from the fire but from the shape of life they'd built, quiet, sure, and stitched together with the kind of days that passed without need for counting. Marabeth stood at the table, pressing down a seam in a new shirt she was sewing for Thayer, the fabric still smelling faintly of hickory smoke from the store barrel it had come in. Elsie sat beside her, threading buttons into a tin for sorting, while Elric crouched by the hearth, drawing shapes in the ash with the handle of the fire poker. Thayer entered from the porch, boots caked in slush, and shook the snow from his hat before hanging it on the peg. "The trap line's clear," he said. "I spotted elk sign out near the pine ridge." Marabeth didn't look up from her stitching. "You planning to track it?" "Not alone. Thought Elric might want to come." The boy straightened. "Really?" Thayer leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You've kept to the chores without trouble. You're old enough to learn the ridge." Elric looked to Marabeth, eyes wide. She laid the shirt flat. "So long as you keep close and listen." "I will," he said, already reaching for his scarf. Elsie reached for Marabeth's hand once they were gone. "Can I help with supper?" Marabeth nodded. "Fetch me the beans." "We'll start with soaking." That evening, after the stew had been eaten and the table cleared, Thayer set a folded map on the table. He smoothed it flat with his palm, tracing a line west of the valley. "Elric asked me something today," he said. Marabeth folded her hands in her lap. "What was it?" "He asked if this land was ours." She waited. "I told him it belongs to the earth first," Thayer continued. "But we're its keepers for as long as we treat it right. And if we do, it'll hold us." Marabeth reached out, fingertips brushing the edge of the map. "You thinking of buying the deed?" "There's a man in Bozeman who holds the papers," Thayer said. "Said I could trade a team of mules and 2 calves for the full claim." "You'd give that up?" "I'd give more, if it means the 4 of us stay here without question." She looked toward the sleeping children, their forms soft beneath the quilts. "Then let's do it," she said. "Let's plant deeper." The snow melted slow. By March, the ground was damp and fragrant, and the chickens scratched eager in the thawed earth. Thayer and Elric built a coop from leftover boards while Marabeth taught Elsie how to mix lye soap, the girl holding her breath and giggling at the sting of vinegar in her nose. When the coop was done, Thayer called Marabeth outside. He held something small in his hand, carved smooth from pine and no bigger than a hen's egg. "It's not much," he said, setting it in her palm. The shape was round at the base, with a carved sprig of wheat on one side and a heart on the other, simple and sure. "I made it the week you came here," he said. "Didn't know yet what it meant, only that I needed to make it." She turned it over slowly. "You kept it all this time?" "I was waiting for the right moment." She looked up at him. "This is it." He drew her close, arms wrapped around her waist, and she leaned into him without hesitation. The sun was warm on their backs, and the wind no longer bit. That night, while the children slept, Marabeth and Thayer sat beneath the stars on the porch, wrapped in a wool blanket, her head resting against his chest. "I used to believe my life would be one long unraveling," she said, voice low. He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "And now I believe it can be sewn back together, with steady hands, and love that stays." He didn't answer with words, just pressed his lips gently to her temple, then rested his cheek there, both of them quiet in the closeness. Spring came full by April. They planted potatoes and beans in neat rows, the children helping with muddy knees and sun-reddened cheeks. Marabeth hung fresh curtains in the cabin, blue calico that fluttered when the window stayed open. Thayer dug fence posts for another paddock, and when the work was done, they sat in the grass behind the barn, watching the clouds drift by. One evening, Elric brought home a bird with a broken wing. Marabeth showed him how to wrap it, and he set it on the windowsill each morning to catch the light. When it healed and flew, he only said, "I hope it remembers us." On a warm afternoon in early June, they rode to town together, Thayer, Marabeth, Elric, and Elsie bringing with them eggs, wool, and laughter. At the mercantile, the children picked penny sweets, and Marabeth traded for a bolt of fabric the color of wild phlox. Thayer settled the deed papers with a handshake and a quiet word. On the ride home, the land rolled golden around them, the mountains blue in the distance. Marabeth reached across the saddle and took Thayer's hand. "Home," she said. He looked toward the cabin, smoke curling from the chimney, the dog waiting near the gate. "Home," he echoed. Years passed, but the rhythm never left. The children grew taller, steadier, learned the land and how to listen to it. The coop filled with hens, the fields with rows of green. Marabeth's hands bore the soft lines of a woman who'd worked and loved deeply. Thayer's hair grayed, but his eyes held the same steady warmth. They built a life not from grand things, but from shared mornings, quiet trust, and the kind of love that didn't need to be spoken to be known. And when the days slowed and the winters softened, they sat side by side on that same porch, hearts full, hands still clasped, watching the land they'd tended bloom once more.